Good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of the Digital Pedagogy Institute. My name is David Hutchison. I'm Director of the Center for Digital Humanities at Brock University, and I'm pleased to have you here. If you're joining us for the first day, welcome. If this is your second day, welcome back. We're going to begin our plenary session in a moment, but first a few thank yous, and you'll probably remember what I'm about to read from what you've heard several times, so feel free to join in. We're going to have a sing-along on the third day, so this is a practice session. So our list of sponsors: Ryerson University for hosting day 3 of the conference, the Center for Digital Humanities, Ryerson University Library and Archives, the Director of E-Learning, the Learning and Teaching Office, the Office of the Dean, Faculty of Arts, the Department of English and its MA Literatures of Modernity program, and the Masters of Digital Media program for donation of financial support. The Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at Brock University, a contribution of financial support towards the conference as well as contributing to planning. Victoria Owen, Chief Librarian, UTSC, for her general financial support and staff resources. And sure, Connections Grant, without which none of the wonderful research and discussions generated here would be possible. And I'm just going to move this microphone. I think it will be making a squeak, so just bear with me. I'm very pleased to introduce Diane Jakacki from Bucknell University. Diane is the Digital Scholarship Coordinator at Bucknell University, where she explores and institutes new ways in which digital humanities tools and methodologies can be leveraged in research and teaching in a small liberal arts environment. She earned her PhD at the University of Waterloo and was a Marion L. Britton Postdoctoral Fellow at Georgia Institute of Technology. She is an Assistant Director of DHSI, where she teaches the Digital Pedagogy course. She's also a member of the Map of Early Modern London's editorial board and the Internet Shakespeare's Editions Pedagogical Advisory Board, the Records of Early English Dramas Digital Advisory Committee, and has published widely on the intersection of digital humanities and early modern studies. Please join me in welcoming Diane.
Good morning, and before we start, I just realized I had a typo that needs to be corrected. Sorry. This goes to show what happens when you try and don't record this. La la la, university is not spelled correctly. Good. Like that. Okay, now we're back. Right? Yes? Great. Okay, I would also like to thank all of the people that David thanked, but I didn't memorize the list. So, but in particular, thank you. But in particular, I'd like to thank Paulina Rousseau, who has been so generous in inviting me here, and also extremely patient yesterday when I wasn't sure if I'd be able to get here because Air Canada coming from Harrisburg is never reliable, let's say that. So there was a question of about 4 or 5 hours when I wasn't sure if the plane was actually going to get here. Paulina, you had some housekeeping?
No.
Okay, good. Well, we'll keep going. But anyway, thank you, Paulina. So a couple of things. I am not a Brian Croxall when it comes to PowerPoint. He rocks PowerPoint. At best, I can do cute, so don't think that this is spectacular. The other thing, I saw Miriam Posner speak at the you're looking at me, at the Keystone DH conference last month in Philadelphia, and her plenary was incredibly thoughtful and thought-provoking. And when I was sitting there listening to her, I thought, oh my God, how am I going to try and do something thought-provoking and not workshoppy when it comes to digital pedagogy? Because I've been all summer in that digital pedagogy workshop mindset. So what I'm trying to do today is to encourage some thinking for all of the people in the room, because we're coming at this from a number of different perspectives. And so what I'm going to do is try and carve out as much time as possible at the end for us to have a discussion as opposed to a Q&A. Because I think what I'm trying to say here, and I'm still working through its ramifications, means something to everybody who considers themselves an instructor, and I think that means all of us. So if we could think about how you want to discuss or challenge or or provoke back or provoke one another, that would be wonderful. And in best digital humanist mode, I actually have several devices, so I'm going to be juggling. In her keynote address at DHSI this summer, Claire Warwick called for more focus on pedagogy within the fields that comprise the digital humanities. She said, it's very important that DH moves from research to teaching. It's important to teach people and train the next generation. Warwick's comments were designed to raise awareness within the DH community that as we draw increasing attention from more traditional humanities disciplines and departments, we need to think about questions of longevity and sustainability in the training of new scholar practitioners, in addition to the continuing focus we must place on funding and institutional infrastructural support. I realize that this audience and the one listening to Claire back in June are somewhat different because the purpose of this conference is in fact focused on pedagogy as opposed to more general DH peer-to-peer training. But I think what she said resonates here because we all find ourselves advocating for more and better and more complex integration of DH into learning environments. Claire's words resonated especially for me working at a small private liberal arts university, still trying to figure out how DH should be integrated into the curriculum. Because Claire went on to call for more attention to be focused on digital humanities pedagogy at the undergraduate level, and spoke to what many of us already know, that students are capable of grasping digital humanities methodologies even at the earliest stages of their academic experience. Oh, look, my Twitter feed is coming through. I spent a lot of time, as I said, giving workshops in a lot of different contexts. My audiences range from tenure track faculty, to adjuncts, to grad students and postdocs, to librarians, to those who, like myself, teach as part of our alternative academic position. See, it's really hard to say. And do. By definition, these audiences also range in terms of teaching experience and confidence with digital tools and methods, as well as their ability in the classroom to exercise their skills and create pedagogically sound courses designed to incorporate critical engagement with digital humanities. I spend a lot of time reassuring people that through articulated course goals, clearly identified learning objectives, planning and transparency, that yes, they too can transform their classrooms into a digital classroom. And this is where I'm not exactly sure if I should be giving them that reassurance. So that's one of the things I'd like to encourage us to discuss. The term digital pedagogy has gained traction in the wake of the digital humanities move from margin to center in the academy. But there's no one definition for digital pedagogy. The term is used to identify everything from MOOCs and clickers, to flipped classrooms and hybrid courses, to blog and wiki assignments, to scaffolded projects in which the digital is intrinsic to course design and learning outcomes. Experimentation at the assignment level gives instructors an excellent venue for experimentation with digital tools and methods. However, this is very different from the design and execution of an intentionally designed course in DH. When we overhaul our syllabi and our teaching methods to transform the classroom and course structure with specifically DH-inflected learning goals and outcomes, it may seem alien and unsettling to our departmental colleagues, but is progressive and truly distinctive in ways that reflect the changing nature of humanities programs and curricula. For me, excuse me, it's important that students who are coming to the university should be trained to be better digital citizens, able to engage critically with digital media, and I believe that it is our responsibility to help them discern between credible and incredible forms of digital discourse. But as humanists, we have an opportunity to bring our research and digital humanities interests into the classroom. That, to me, is a major point of difference. And that is why I've begun to use the term digital humanities pedagogy, cute, when I speak about and write about that distinction. It's really distracting having my Twitter feed going. I'm not sure what I'm going to do. This summer has been one steeped in digital humanities and pedagogy for me. As Miriam and I were speaking about before, it seems like there's been this roadshow of conference and workshop and institute that keeps going on and on. I've done everything from give papers and two lightning round pedagogy workshops, lightning round meaning a 2-hour workshop, to fit all of digital pedagogy at Congress. I did the marathon at DHSI, which is the complete opposite, 5 intensive days of teaching. I gave 2 papers at DHSI in Sydney. I've spent the summer collaborating on DH research projects and course design with over, I think, 20 faculty members and students at Bucknell. Last week, I taught another week-long workshop at Bucknell where 12 participating faculty members, out of the 12, 8 decided over the course of the week that they're going to integrate DH in a pretty significant way into their fall courses. And I'll talk about what that means later, but it was kind of exhausting. And Monday I start teaching my own course, and the syllabus isn't finished yet, which should be par for the course, but is making me a little anxious. So you see, obviously I think about this a lot. And increasingly I find myself thinking about more than what we teach and how we teach it. In the 2 months since I sat in Victoria listening to Claire Warwick's keynote, something has been pinging at the back of my brain. And only over this past weekend, when I was at a family reunion in New Hampshire and supposedly off the grid, that it actually occurred to me what it was that Claire had said that bothered me. It was this: it's important to teach people and train the next generation. That seems obvious and universal and has nothing to do, per se, with the digital humanities. But when I change it into this, it's important to teach digital humanities and train the next generation of digital humanists, which I know is what Claire was saying in that context. I'm left asking a pretty significant set of questions. I ask why and who. I thought over the past 5 years I'd come up with answers that have become pat when people ask me these questions. But when I step back and think about it, when people have asked me these questions, I've defaulted into answers that have more to do with what and how than why and who. I think I'm going to need to leave why away from this, because I think that's way too profound in another keynote or perhaps an entire conference in itself, and probably has already been challenged. But so I would like to speak about who. And what I said is I'd like to leave extra time at the end of this, because I think we are who, but who are we? That's cosmic. Text analysis, encoding, data and spatial visualization, desktop fabrication, ELIT, not ELAT. The list of methods, that's something different. The list of methods that comprise the digital humanities continues to grow and expand and evolve in ways that speak to the term big tent, in ways that I don't think the people who coined the term big tent meant. And I think that has to do with the types of people who are working in the types of methods in the discipline. Just as there's no one defining method for the digital humanities, there's no consensus on what is being taught in the classroom. And I think that's important and healthy. We can't dictate a meat and potatoes approach to DH at the same time that we strive to make DH inclusive rather than exclusive. But we must move from a position of experimentation to one of intention as we develop pedagogical approaches. If we're going to develop DH curricula with an eye toward establishing degrees and majors and minors and certificates, then we must think carefully about how we incorporate different facets of DH, practicum and theory, into various learning environments. When it comes to undergraduate DH, which I suppose is my specialization these days, that also means balancing, foundation courses, surveys, special topics, independent study, and capstone projects and theses. It also means balancing code-heavy and theory-heavy courses. At Bucknell, we're at the beginning of that process and trying to lay out a program that reflects the interdisciplinary nature of a traditional liberal arts education. We're by no means the only ones doing it, but I'm just in a position to explain how we're approaching it, so be patient with my focus. This fall, I will teach the 4th iteration of a DH survey course that my colleague Katie Fall and I designed last year. The course challenges students to engage critically with DH by working and reworking a core archival text. They produce a transcription, then do text analysis, a TEI marked up digital edition, data visualization of people mentioned in the text, and a story map that considers key places and spatial data represented in the narrative. Each module builds on the last, reinforcing the multifaceted nature of humanities research and challenging students to think about which approaches help them to ask questions of the core text that they might not consider through more traditional humanities means. Katie and I each chose discrete archival texts and data sets that we thought would be compelling to students. Last year, I chose a subsection of a Civil War diary written by a Bucknell graduate and moldering in our very small archive in the basement, which hadn't even been sorted. There was no finding tool or anything, so I just grabbed stuff out of a box, read it, and shot it on my iPhone and used that as our core text. This year, I'll have students work with me on a 16th century publication called Tarleton's Jests that I'm editing for the Digital Renaissance editions, as well as some 1580s performance records on the Queen's Men that I've pulled from the records of early English drama. And Jason will know that Richard Tarleton has been an obsession of mine since my dissertation. Holgersheim actually told me as my external that I should stop doing the rest of my dissertation and just focus on Tarleton, that the rest of the stuff, clearly this was what was my passion. And he's, if you fall in love with a 400-year-old dead clown, make it Richard Tarleton. So the course looks like this. Students will transcribe the 16th century black letter printed publication from a facsimile that I've got from the Huntington Library. There's no modern edition of Tarleton's Jests. The last one was, I think, badly printed in 1823, something like that. So they're actually going to be working with a text that hasn't really been negotiated except by me and some other of a small group of fangirls for over 200 years or 400 years. They will modernize and standardize the spelling and then run that text through the Voyant 2.0 analysis suite that Stefan and Jeffrey were demonstrating. Yes, they were demonstrating at Sydney, and I think again yesterday or tomorrow? It's coming up. Yesterday. See, time is nonlinear. They will then identify some keywords relating to sentiment and run the text again through Centistrength, I think, and I'm open to any other suggestions in terms of sentiment analysis tools. They will mark up the text twice in TEI. A first pass in Juxta Editions, which is it's a web-based, panel-based markup environment. And then they're going to do a second, more complex pass in the Oxygen editing environment. They will then work with 4 data sets that have to do with politics and socioeconomic factors in England in the 1580s, alongside acting troupe touring data to find geospatial patterns in ArcGIS online. That seems like a lot, and it is a lot. The fact that it's a course offered exclusively to first and second year students demonstrates either our confidence or our madness, or both. And yet I think what made the course successful for us last year, and it really was successful, the students just seemed to glom on to what it was we were trying to teach them to do, and not realizing the sophisticated way in which they were approaching these texts. But I think it had to do with the fact that they felt that they owned the material. And again, this is work that hadn't been negotiated properly or at a high editorial level, except by a few of us. And so they understood, and we made them understand that this was special for them, and that this was something that they would be publishing in many ways. The texts with which they worked were unfamiliar, sometimes to us as well as to them. I'm not a 19th centuryist. I'm not an Americanist. I'm not an historian. I know Civil War from my American high school history classes and watching the Ken Burns documentary. So oftentimes it was much as a discovery for me as for them. I know a lot more about Tarleton, so I'm not so worried about that. They also were able to discern which approaches and tools revealed more to them as individual junior scholars, because we treated them as junior scholars and as colleagues, which flattened the experience in the classroom. It was no longer a one-to-many, teacher to student. It was very much a horizontal, many-to-many approach. In her course evaluation, one of my students actually wrote that she had never learned so much about someone she'd never heard of before. And this was this fellow, James Merrill Lynn, who was a Bucknell grad and a local lawyer. Not a big name by anyone's understanding of the Civil War, except to his family. But more important, I think, we put these 18 and 19-year-olds into a situation that Janelle Genstad has modeled in the Map of Early Modern London Project's pedagogical partnership, where students become nascent research assistants and collaborators. They work with their instructors and WOML staff on content that becomes part of the site. And like Janelle and her team, we're inviting students to ask their own research questions and use DH methods to analyze and synthesize data. And I forgot that had learning goals. So in the course, the specific DH learning goals, which were laid out on top of humanities department learning goals, were that students construct research questions and artifacts that demonstrate proficiency in interpretation, analysis, and evaluation of DH methodologies in their specific contexts, that they exhibit facility with DH conventions regarding forms of composition and communication across academic disciplines and cultural situations, that they demonstrate understanding of the collaborative aspects of DH production and demonstrate the ability to work both individually and in group settings, that they analyze and critique the embeddedness of construction of race, gender, ethnicity, and sexuality in DH scholarly discourse, and that they compose reflections that articulate superior understanding of the generative process involved in engagement with DH scholarship. Those are actually developing learning goals that we're continuing to draft and refine as we're putting together a more curricular program at Bucknell. So don't tell anyone. Just want to make sure where I've gone. Okay, things. Map of Modern London. Okay. Another thing that for Katie's and my students that's important to notice, not one at that point had declared or has gone on to declare a humanities major. We had engineers, computer scientists, management, psychology, and education students. Well, sometimes this seems to be problematic for the humanities trying to reach out to other departments and disciplines across the campus. We actually found that it created an opportunity for us to connect humanities through the digital in a very transparent way for STEM students. The experience that they were able to apply from learning their disciplinary work, their code, their algorithms, actually gave them an insight into what the humanities do. I actually had a student who came to me and said, I've been working in data visualization, and now I want to understand how humanists do this, right? Which never occurred to me that we would do it differently, but it's learning for me. Of the students we had in the 3 iterations of the course last year, 5 students in our sections went on to do independent study projects with us. And again, none of them were humanities majors, and they wanted to work more with these materials. And again, this summer, I think 4 more went on to be research assistants in humanities faculty-led DH projects. And of those, 3 were computer science majors. As a result, of these summer faculty-driven DH research projects, those students have claimed, and some of their faculty members have expressed surprise that these students have more code experience than those in their cohort. So yeah. Teaching a course like the one I've described is far from easy. It requires an immense amount of planning, a more than basic understanding of tools, methods, and the growing body of scholarship about DH in order to expect students to achieve the level of competence articulated in the course goals. It requires a structure that is solid and yet flexible enough to respond to the pace at which students can engage with tools, produce and reflect upon artifacts, as well as to discover and experiment and to improvise when technology fails. Because as we all know, it will invariably fail at the worst possible moment. Shadow puppets. It also requires an unusual level of honesty and transparency on the part of the instructor in order to gain students' trust with methods that are in so many ways alien to them. Because I do believe the term digital native is a misnomer. Most of these teenagers are really just passive consumers of technology when they walk into my classroom, and I think we probably all would agree with that, and would like to debunk that with our colleagues who assume that these students are so facile with technology. As I said, I talk about these things at workshops and conferences, but the one thing that I repeatedly try to inject into the discussion, and the one thing that my audiences, and frankly myself, don't really want to talk about is access. The course I teach and the type of digital humanities pedagogy I describe requires almost ubiquitous access to hardware and software. It's a kind of, for want of a shoe, the horse was lost. And I'm afraid that might be a dated term now. Okay, I just realized I probably dated myself. It's like, who knows about horseshoes? I can teach my course because I'm almost certain that all of my students have a laptop that I can tell them to bring to class. Students can go to the tech desk and borrow one if they drop theirs off the top bunk in their dorm room, which has happened to me. There are also plenty of computers in the library and in labs across campus. Bucknell has a site license for ArcGIS, which means that all students can engage in geospatial analysis at a very high level. We have reliable Wi-Fi across campus and an IT department that installs and manages our WordPress and Omeka farms. We have GIS and video specialists. We have a team of instructional technologists, and the list goes on and on. We're lucky. When I did a postdoc at Georgia Tech, I was able to expect an even higher level of computing power and support. A prerequisite for matriculation at Georgia Tech was the ownership of a personal laptop. Granted, Georgia Tech was renowned as an engineering school, but it was also a state school at which most students relied heavily upon scholarship to attend. So regardless of their socioeconomic status, I could require that my students bring a laptop to class. As I said, I teach at what is described as an elite private liberal arts university. Bucknell has made a significant financial commitment to building and sustaining a strong digital infrastructure and significant resources with the goal of ensuring a high level of student engagement with technology across the curriculum, not just in STEM fields. My students are predominantly middle class or upper middle class Americans who graduated in the top 10 percentile of their high school classes. International students come from similar backgrounds. There's a lot of talk about diversity and inclusivity, but Bucknell's is a very homogeneous student population. And most Bucknell students don't realize how unusual their education really is. And that rolls over into their experiences with technology. So frankly, I come to digital humanities in the classroom from a position of privilege and arrogance. And I don't mean to be arrogant with you. I'm setting this up to make a point. It's uncomfortable for me to admit that I am arrogant about this and expectant. And what I teach and the way I teach it is frankly not scalable across universities. And that makes me sad. It's not universally applicable in institutions of higher education or at secondary, at high schools and primary education. And in my class, things would crumble very quickly if I were to start subtracting things. So, without student access to laptops in the classroom, I would have to teach in a lab, which would not be a hardship if I could guarantee that my classes would be scheduled in that lab from 1 to 2, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday through the entire semester, which Miriam and I were just commiserating about before. Without ready access to a lab, I could not build in-class work time with installed applications and online platforms. Students would have to learn and master software programs and digital methods on their own or on university machines in the library or in labs, which would not be an insurmountable hardship if I could guarantee that my students could get ready access to those machines. Without easy access to university computers or internet, students would have to find alternative means to use technology on their own time in an asynchronous environment. Ultimately, I'm not sure whether this course could surmount that challenge. Considered another way, if my university was not a residential one, if a significant number of students commuted, for example, they would be even more reliant upon a computer they owned, plus personal access to the internet, in order to complete assignments. Collaborative assignments would be even more difficult to complete. This would be exacerbated, I think, if they were part-time students working their way through college with 1 or 2 or even 3 jobs to pay for their tuition, and their schedules were dictated by their jobs. And what about students without the financial means to own a computer or without ready access to the internet at home? I think the Georgia Tech example is absolutely anomalous, frankly. I don't know of a lot of universities that expect that kind of financial commitment regardless of background. And yet one other way, and maybe this is the most profound and one that I think is going to challenge us significantly as we go forward, is what about students for whom physical access to digital environments is a significant challenge, and maybe one that we have to learn how to address differently. How do we make accommodations for students with disabilities? I don't mean to be depressing. Please don't be depressed or throw up my hands in despair, but I think that these are metrics we need to think seriously about. Traditionally, digital humanities has been considered at a graduate school level. It certainly was when I was in graduate school. First with graduate students working for established research projects, and more recently in professional training contexts, earning certificates in DH as part of their degree. It was taken for granted, I think, that these graduate students would have adequate access to the hardware and software they needed because they were working on digital humanities research projects that required software and hardware. As DH takes on a more curricular level, takes root at a more curricular level, both in graduate and undergraduate programs, and as the idea of a DH degree or major or minor becomes a reality, we need to think hard about who are our students, what they're capable of, and the environment in which we can teach them. So what I'd like to do is spin that cutting away example into something to try and build it back up and figure out how I might teach the Humanities 100 course in an alternative way. But first, water. At an absolute minimum, my students would have to have access to a computer with internet. I don't know how I could not require that. The computer could be a desktop or a laptop. It could be mobile or anchored. To level the playing field, though, I think the project work would have to be done outside of the class. No computers should be in a classroom where not everyone can have access to a computer. That's my belief. That means that collaborative project work, which I emphasize in the course's current iteration, would have to be managed asynchronously or minimized in some way within the syllabus. All applications and work environments would have to be open access and or freely available online. I don't think that would be too much of a problem in my case. I use Juxta Editions, as I said, for transcription and preliminary markup. I use Palladio for data visualization often. I could certainly shift WordPress and Omeka from the .org to the .com or .net online environments. I already use the Google Apps Suite. Bucknell has the Google Apps Suite baked into it, so I think it wouldn't be too much of a difficulty for students to manage documents and calendars and even CSV files for data sets in that type of open environment, if you believe Google is open. And I would even give up, I know ArcGIS, hard to give up, but I would give up ArcGIS and substitute something like Google Maps or something equivalent without, I think, too much loss in terms of analysis. Class time would be given over almost entirely to discussion of process, progress, and assigned readings. What I now call lab time, when students install, register, set up, and experiment with their work environments and/or focus on collaborative work, would have to be adjusted to something more along the lines of demo time, where I would provide some sort of pre-baked tutorial that they could then access again later, and maybe troubleshoot problems with them. Again, at an absolute minimum, I would need some kind of podium PC with internet access and viable browsers and some sort of projection system. That seems ubiquitous, but I know in many schools that's a luxury. Smart classroom is a luxury. And then I think student accommodation would have to become intrinsic in the classroom and not the exception. I would have to ensure, although I do now, that students with certain types of disabilities could take part on par with their classmates in all work. Likewise, while certain forms of digital work are designed to be public-facing, I would find ways to secure or anonymize student work. I do this now, but it would have to be more proactive in teaching students about audience and privacy versus policy. To go off script for a moment, which I kind of sort of do, I had one student once who I never was exactly sure what was going on, but that student seemed to be under some sort of protection. And so that student's name was actually not given out in class. And that student was not able to work in public environments for that student's safety. And that is profound to me, but those things happen. And you have to be ready to acknowledge that, especially when you're thinking about, and particularly when you're thinking about digital humanities where the default is public. What do you do for a student who has to be protected? Another curious and surprising thing that happened to me is that I had a student from China who had brought their laptop with them from China, and for whatever reason, they were unable to download certain types of software and or engage in certain types of online based or web-based platforms. So ultimately, that student had to go out and decided to go out and buy their own computer, but here, a North American-based computer. But that student otherwise had to work on a lab computer, which, again, these are things that we don't anticipate, but we need to learn how to respond to. I think I could do all these things in the course. I would have to accept, though, that the teaching burden would rise significantly, and that I would need to spend more time building tutorials and otherwise troubleshooting on my time for students outside of class, and not necessarily working with them during class or during traditional office hours. It means that the way I teach would have to expand exponentially in order to set up those systems. I would need to be almost entirely independent as an instructor, I think, expecting a minimum of infrastructural or even technical support. And this means that I would have to be absolutely confident that I could teach all digital methods included in the course. I could do all of that. I could adjust those things and still, I believe, address the course goals I've already identified. It would take a lot of work, but I think it might be more scalable to other different learning environments across a broader spectrum of institutions. and because so many of us share our syllabi openly with our colleagues online, this is something that I would feel that was reasonable to share. I'd still like to share my own current syllabus, but I think that would also be something reasonable. I think I'm confident and creative and resourceful enough to do it, but I would want to make sure that the course modules and assignments were evergreen, frankly, enough so that I wouldn't have to rebuild this course every single semester. I don't think I could do that. And I'm not convinced, although somebody could challenge and prove me wrong, that an entire DH program could be managed successfully in this way. One course maybe, but an entire major or minor or degree, I don't think so. And by successful, I mean a major or a minor or certificate that offers substantial DH learning experiences, producing what we would consider to be competent digital humanists, and maybe more than competent, excellent digital humanists. I'm not sure where I'm going next in terms of text. This leads me to another question that I think speaks directly to this audience. I want to know who is teaching DH and who is responsible for training this next generation. So quick show of hands, how are we doing on time? We good? How many of you are tenure track faculty? Okay. How many of you are adjunct faculty? How many are graduate students or postdocs? How many of you are librarians? How many of you are instructional technologists or designers? How many of you are ALTAC? Woohoo! Okay, now, how many of you are scheduled to teach or co-teach or are embedded in a course that involves significant application of DH or a high level of technology during the coming academic year? Okay, pretty significant number. I ask these questions because you and all of us represent the instructor pool for digital humanities across the curriculum. And I'm not convinced that our universities understand what this means in terms of human resources for instruction, what it means to teach digital subject matter. When I was on the job market, I included digital humanities prominently in my list of research interests and included digital pedagogy-rooted courses in my teaching dossier. I applied for jobs that identified DH as one of the fields of research or administrative focus. And yet in several interviews, it became clear to me that the search committees didn't really know what they meant by digital humanities, and were sometimes uncomfortable or even resistant to ways in which it might play out in the classroom, in a classroom environment. I recall a particularly awkward exchange in an interview about Twitter in the classroom, where I finally had to walk away and say, well, no, don't worry about Twitter, it won't hurt you. It was very disturbing. I do think that's changing, and in large part because of the efforts of scholars like Miriam, Brian Croxall, Ryan Cordell, Lee Scalarup-Bissett, and many others who shared their experiences and expertise, acting as advocates to administrators and department heads, and as mentors to those of us who follow on their heels, clarifying how such work should be undertaken and assessed, and how one should position oneself on the market and within disciplines to demonstrate success. I know from my experience at Bucknell that what began as a position heavily predicated on outreach to faculty in the College of Arts and Sciences has changed into one that is frankly almost swamped by the number of faculty who want to reconfigure their courses to include at least one major digital assignment or module. I can only give so many faculty workshops and consults without expecting a significant uptake in interest. I mentioned that workshop last week before. Of those 8 who want to incorporate something into their classroom, some want to do mapping, some text encoding, some text analysis, some data visualization. I don't do all of those things well enough to help those faculty members do all of those things. And considering that those 8 are on top of all of the other faculty members who are already engaged in doing digital work in the classroom that requires collaboration and support, it's becoming unsustainable. This year, there are probably at Bucknell going to be 40 DH-inflected courses. Next year, that number is almost certain to rise. With all of these faculty members, I've demonstrated how I've taught these assignments. I've helped them to create rubrics and develop assessment techniques that emphasize critical engagement and process, and how they should not fall prey to the pretty shiny, right? They need to think about critically what these mean and not, wow, that was a beautiful map. But I would estimate that very few of these faculty members feel confident teaching DH assignments without some form of assistance. And that means that someone, a librarian, a specialist, an instructional technologist, or someone like me is embedded in or co-teaching several of these courses. We may not be identified as an instructor of record, but in effect, we can become that. Even the course that I'm teaching, one which I was fairly confident I could teach in its current iteration, required the collaboration of Katie Fall, my colleague, whose understanding of network analysis far outpaced mine, and the participation of Janine Glather, our GIS specialist, who helped me to design and teach the GIS mapping module. It also required the assistance of classroom support and our information technology departments, who assigned me a special smart classroom and installed Gephi and Oxygen onto university computers. What I'm saying is that the traditional model of one instructor, or perhaps an instructor plus grad student TA, or multiple TAs for a course doesn't work in DH. The model has to change to reflect complementary teaching skill sets, and skill sets that change and evolve as the tools and platforms and devices students use to do this work expand, become more sophisticated, become more available. Frankly, it's wonderful when a student can show me something that I don't already know about a tool we're working with. If they can hack the Python or do whatever and actually transform our assignment, and that's wonderful. But I also don't think that we should expect students to teach themselves or to teach one another. That's a different model entirely. So how do we manage this multi-instructor model? Obviously, resources are not infinite, and the idea of embedding a librarian or a specialist or a colleague or multiples of any of these people in a course is not scalable. Certainly in my experience at Bucknell, my understanding of successful outreach, incorporating DH into a broad array of courses and research projects at all levels in the humanities and social sciences, has led to the question of when we have to say not now or not this semester. And I'm not comfortable saying that. What does that mean? That courses are removed from the catalog because there's suddenly not a human resource available to be embedded or co-teach a module or to support work on an assignment? What message are we sending when we teach teachers how to do something that requires additional expertise, but then don't have the resources to apply that expertise as widely as it is demanded? I'm certain that the ways in which I teach and the tools I bring into the classroom are utterly transformative for my students. They do engage with subject matter differently, and the bridge between humanities and STEM interests and aptitudes is reinforced. I think it is incumbent upon me to think more carefully and creatively about how I can teach differently, more inclusively, and model that for others with different structures and resources. I'm not despairing. I truly believe that many of these questions and issues are arising at the best possible time when higher education and the humanities more specifically are thinking hard about the ways in which we provide meaningful education to new generations of students. And I think that our hopes and expectations for curricular DH will adjust as we better understand our own abilities and the support we can expect from our universities. This is the discussion that I think we need to have, and have it very loudly. We need to identify different models for teaching DH and have a voice in how we implement them. What I'm saying ultimately is that in taking up Claire Warwick's challenge to teach and train, we need to think seriously at all levels about how we do that, who we're teaching, and who is doing the teaching, not just this semester or this academic year, but in the years to come. So thank you. Right.
We have an opportunity, Diane, for some questions and open discussion.
Yes.
And we actually have about 20 minutes.
Awesome.
Ample opportunity. I think, Diane, you're going to call on people yourself, you said? And,
Yes.
We'll open up the discussion.
Yes.
Now.
And I'd rather feel free to talk amongst yourselves too, because I don't want this to be a one-to-many situation. Jeffrey.
So thank you for a great talk. I'm in the same position where I finished my syllabus. Recently expanded some of the things I might want to include. But over the years I've been going to the DH conferences. It seemed to me that in the late 80s and 90s, early 90s, we included a lot more people talking about instructional technology. And in particular, we had the computer-assisted language learning community. There was always panels about this in our conferences, and then somehow they got driven out. I don't know if we drove them out, or if, so my hypothesis is that the community had a lot more out-act people, and then as we got graduate programs, we all of a sudden got the professionals, in quotation marks, the people who needed to publish, and then all of a sudden refereeing of articles began to be done by professionals, for professionals. In some sense, the people doing language learning, instructional technology got driven out. And it's clear to me from your talk that we need to stop that.
Yeah.
But I don't know how. How can the community make sure that it doesn't, those who have to get tenure and have to publish don't drive out those who have different tracks and different ways of being assessed?
So is the question, how do the alternative academic participants in the academy take more of a prominent role, or that they're not marginalized by?
Well, how does the community preserve an environment which that big tent that is exclusive? Because I think it's professionalizing. As we get graduate programs, we get PhD students. As we get PhD students, we get people that need to give papers at conferences.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, the more informal mixture that seems to be the case at Bucknell seems to me might be driven out. So how do we avoid that?
It's funny, I guess coming from an alt-act position, I don't feel driven out necessarily. I feel that my participation in conferences and my publications are actually gaining traction, and maybe that's my own experience. I think it's challenging at your home institution when in an alternative academic position that type of scholarship is not necessarily considered at the top of your promotion, review. I'm not sure how to answer that question, and I'd look to other people too. I think we're in the throes of it, frankly. I think we're all trying to figure out, certainly one of my concerns, frankly, is that there's been this assumption that I've heard in graduate programs that alt-act is this silver bullet, right? And I think it's been written about in the Chronicle too, that in fact, those who can't get tenure track positions, don't worry, you'll find an alt-act position in DH specifically, because they're legion, and that's not the case either. But that's a huge, more systemic problem with graduate programs more generally. I don't know, does anybody else have? I don't think I'm doing a good job of answering your question.
I don't think I've got the question clear in my head.
We'll just tease it out.
Well, it just strikes me that the question you're asking also has to do with the point that you made fairly late in your talk about the traditional pedagogical model, being centered on the professor with the TA, and this being the sort of, the top down. That's the kind of professional that you're talking about. So I think it would go beyond the problem of conferences. The way that DH happens is based on a different model of professionalism, which is kind of at odds with the incentives that tenure and promotion and everything else has. So it's kind of like there's this community over here, this great big structure over here which has protocols.
Right. Well, yeah, and my dean is actually trying to figure out how to negotiate that in terms of teaching evaluations, because frankly, staff don't
Yeah.
those
They do
evaluations
those
don't
before.
count?
The way you describe it, though, I think is helpful. You described it as traditional, but that tradition only goes back
Yeah.
to the 40s.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
I don't know
Yeah.
to when.
Yeah.
But it's, a lot of this discourse talks about, I'm outside your tent, so I'm an interloper here.
Yes, but I've seen you twice now,
Yes.
this summer.
Yeah.
You're on the periphery of the
Yeah,
tent.
yeah, and I'm impressed by your commitment to this. I'm concerned there was a lack of, I haven't seen enough reflection on what's being given up by stepping away
Yeah.
from the podium. And this new model, to describe it as going away from the tradition is to make it sound you're hackers and you're innovating and you're
Yeah.
disrupting. What is it is this Uber? And are we screwing the taxi drivers by doing this? Are we dismantling a system whose virtues we never really understood? So there's a book came out, Ivory Tower Blues. It said the university's shit now, and back in the day, the authors, when I was a grad student, everything was great. Or we just were tipping out, so the early 70s, everyone knew how to write.
Right.
And now students are all idiots. And the university sucks.
Yeah.
And there's a lack of, where's the baseline
Yeah.
for establishing when the university was great?
I,
Like, what is it we're disrupting when we're displacing or innovating?
see, I'm uncomfortable with the aggressive terms, like the
Right.
disruption. I thought Amy Earhart gave a talk at Congress about that, and it was really provocative for me because I, get very tense when I'm not making everybody happy. But I'm not sure I'm advocating that all of the university be reconfigured in terms of teaching. I think it's a very particular type of course or curricular engagement that needs to recognize that the onus can't be on one faculty member or one teacher. That in fact, in order to do this properly, you do need the participation of more and different types of instructors. And that's the part that's really difficult to scale and sustain.
Right.
I was lucky in that when I was at Georgia Tech, I had a great relationship with my research librarian. And she and I collaborated on building 2 courses together, and it was really successful. It was only partially DHE, but it was really strong in research. And we presented the work we'd done together, and we realized as we were presenting it that there was no way when there were 50 courses, 50 sections of the communication and composition course being taught every semester, that we could do that. Certainly I wasn't teaching 50, and that we didn't have 50 research librarians or even divide by 3 sections or whatever. So I think that's where my tension is. It's, how do you properly address this need that is in a new way interdisciplinary, sort of, and support it properly. And there are lots of schools that only have one instructional technologist, and that instructional technologist is responsible for the learning management system, full stop. That's all they're able to do. And that's not a criticism. That means that they are responsible for everybody's learning management system on campus. And they don't have the time. They crave the time to be able to do more things. So I guess I'm not trying to say the university is bad or wrong or broken. And if I am saying that, it's certainly not what I meant to say. But I think there are a lot of questions about the systemic nature of developing students for particular professional tracks.
I didn't mean that you were saying.
Oh, okay, no. I'm going to go fall over myself to apologize. Yeah, it's hard. This is not simple stuff.
Thank you for that talk. It's wonderful. I want to return to the students for a second. And first of all, the course here is online. I love it.
It's fun.
That's it. I think when you use these phrases like junior scholars, co-researchers, collaborators, and I'm totally for that. I just wonder how that plays out in terms of assessment. When you're suggesting on the one hand that we're part of a team,
Yeah.
and on the other hand, I'm still a lecturer grade using
Yes.
72.
Yeah.
How do you go about discussing rationale for the course? without being offensive,
Mhm.
and also creating an assessment model
Yeah.
that is fair to group work and
Okay, several questions. The first thing, I think I'm careful to phrase to students their role as members of a research team and to model how that works at a higher scholarly level. That there are PIs, and then there are co-PIs, and then there are research assistants, and then there are developing research assistants, and there are levels of junior and seniority. Is it juniority? It is now a term. So what I try to explain is that this is the type of model we're creating. So hierarchy. Yeah, it is. I mean, you can't get away from hierarchy. But at the same time that I respect the work that they're developing and that they're trying to improve upon it. So there's a lot of work in my course that is procedural and generative, so that they're refining the work they do as they go along. I don't accept what they do on day 5 as pristine, and in fact, I tell them it won't ever be pristine because mine is not pristine. So how can I expect that of them? I work very hard to identify rubrics that explain simply but as fully as possible what it means to produce something that has a critical component and a design component and a digital component. And I try to explain this in comparison with more traditional literary studies. If you were writing an essay, you would be doing this, 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 and this. These things still apply, and this is how they're achievable. With Janelle Jenstad's program, her pedagogical program at Map of Early Modern London, it's clear in the core, and I encourage you to go look at her site because it explains it. She has the instructor act as the editor, and all of the students who work on those essays and research those places for the gazetteer, they are all working in draft form. So ultimately, the instructor and the people on the Map of Early Modern London team go through and edit and refine what they contribute to. But they're all identified as collaborators on the site. So they actually have a publication line, a CD line. It's not perfect, but I think it helps to show students how their work can contribute to something greater. As far as group and individual work, I try very hard to ensure that in the rubric there's a balance, so that work that is collaborative is considered, the artifact is a collaborative one, but there are documents that go into that process that indicate as clearly as possible that I can see, so status reports, progress reports, self-evaluations by the students and group evaluations by the students, in addition to my observations, so that they can consider the work that they do in light of the work that others do, that I get an insight into what's going on in those groups that I might not see otherwise, and I have them complete a purely individual component so that they are, there is a balance in terms of grading something, because it comes, as much as I wouldn't want to give grades, there are grades, and so they need to understand that their individual commitment plays into a larger collaborative context. Needs a lot more, like the rubric takes on this really funky, sliding scale rule. Yes?
You mentioned students in your 100 level class that went on to keep studying what they were studying, but did you hear anything about humanities specializing students who went on to try to use maybe like DH tools, things like Omega that you mentioned in classes that were DH centered or didn't have?
That weren't, yes. Yeah, I actually had a student who I found out anecdotally went into, I think the next semester she was in a classics course and wanted to do, I think she wanted to do, it wasn't an Omeka instance, she wanted to do something with 3D immersive environments, which is something we hadn't dealt with in the course, but we had talked about in terms of, I showed them a number of different research projects. and what they meant in terms of types of tools. And so that one, she actually tried, we got her a SketchUp license, and she experimented with building models. So yes, that was a very long-winded way of saying yes. And but what was really interesting was that almost from the get-go, we had students asking if they could minor in DH. And they were asking before we had considered whether or not we could do that. So if you have students asking for something, you start thinking maybe that's interesting, right? So that was kind of cool.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have kind of a logistical question.
Mm-hmm.
Which is I really liked the way that your assignments were structured to build upon one another and sort of walk students
Yep.
through the different aspects of what you need to get to the next
Mhm.
step. Have you come across situations in which, and you have strategies for dealing with students who might not do very well at the early stages? Because it seems
Yep.
like if they don't take the work seriously or
Yes.
don't have the aptitude for the work
Yep.
on, it's impossible to slow down.
I didn't see it snowball, but yes. So in the first iteration of the course, I had one student who, at first they looked at this 19th century faded, hand-scribbled, diary which had been written on a writing box on shipboard and in the field, and certainly not sitting home at university. And they blanched, right? They were like, I can't read this. I don't know what this means. I had one student who became a transcription junkie. That's all she wanted to do. She wanted to continue doing transcription. She based her independent study on doing transcription. I had to make sure she did something with the transcription, but we were able to figure that out. But that was unusual that the students got that. Others really loved the idea of data visualization. I think that to those who are more numbers and patterns oriented was really compelling. Others still found mapping to be something that they fell in love with to tell a story. I had one student who was a sailor, and he just didn't care about any of this stuff. And we sat down and we were working on it, and we found that there was a section of the diary that described Lynn's progress on shipboard down the Carolina coast and up through the Hatteras Inlet. And there had been this storm, and ships foundered, and it was a big kerfuffle. And so he went, and we found a map from 1861 that was a nautical map for pilots to figure out the Hatteras Inlet and where they could maneuver because of the depths. And he took that and the documentation or the data that he found in the diary, and actually was able to trace where the boat that Lynn had been on went through, and where it foundered and where it was rescued and all that. Things that I don't know because I'm not a sailor. But so it took him until the end of the course to master something that he loved. But more important, they started working with one another. And especially in the transcription phase, if somebody found a word that they couldn't figure out, somebody else said, oh yeah, I found that word too, I think it means this, and they would parse it out. When we were doing markup, they actually thought about together, we had editorial meetings where they decided what they were going to mark up and how, so that it was standardized across the text, right? I didn't want any syncretic markup because that doesn't help you, but they actually had to collaborate on that in a very, even though they were doing individual markup, they were using a schema that worked for everybody, right? So it helped that some people, I think they saw that some were stronger in some ways and others in others, and that they could work together and with me to figure out what they enjoyed doing. And their final project was one that they decided on. So they got to emphasize that particular passion. Are we up? Okay.
I'm conscious of time.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Let's take an opportunity once again to thank Diane very much.